You thought you knew the Wild West? I doubt it. The movies showed you the cleaned-up version, handsome heroes and happy endings. The reality had massacres with no punishment, children dying in the snow, land sold in Europe that was nothing but dust, and a winter that wiped out the cattle. These are 22 facts too unbelievable to seem true, and every one of them is documented. Number 1. Rock Springs. 28 dead and no one arrested. On September 2, 1885, in the mining town of Rock Springs, Wyoming, a group of white miners marched into the Chinese neighborhood. They blamed the Chinese for accepting lower wages and taking their jobs. What came next was a massacre. 28 Chinese workers killed, 15 wounded, and 79 homes looted and burned, all in broad daylight in front of hundreds of people. 16 men were arrested. But here comes the part that makes you shake your head. At the trial, not a single white witness agreed to say they had seen even one crime. Everyone kept their mouth shut. With no testimony, the jury let all 16 men go and even had the nerve to blame the victims themselves for the fire. No one paid for what happened, and it did not stop there. For 13 years, the army had to remain stationed in the town just to protect the Chinese people who dared to return home. Number 2. The school was a hole in the ground. Stop and imagine sending your child to a school dug into the earth. On the plains of Kansas, Nebraska, and the Dakotas, there was no wood as far as the eye could see. So settlers cut blocks of grass and roots straight out of the ground and stacked them like bricks, or dug the classroom into the side of a hill. A single room held 30, sometimes 40 children, from 6 to 16 years old, all together. One teacher handled everything. There were not many books, so 3 or 4 students shared the same page. In the winter, freezing wind blew through the dirt walls, and no one could keep the place properly heated. In the summer, snakes and insects crawled through the cracks and fell from the grass roof. The so-called little house on the prairie that looked so beautiful in stories was actually dark, damp, and cramped. The people who studied there learned to read by making do with the little they had. Number 3. 1 in every 4 cowboys was black. Think of the classic image of the American cowboy. Now understand that the picture is incomplete. Historians estimate that about 1 in every 4 cowboys on the major cattle drives was black. Most came from Texas, right after the Civil War. They were men born into slavery or the sons of freed slaves. And here is the detail almost no one talks about. Many of them knew cattle better than the white men who were new to the business. They had learned how to rope, break horses, and drive cattle years before freedom came. On the trail, they faced the same dangers, the same dust, and the same cold nights under the same sky. But when the herd reached town, the way they were treated changed completely. They could not enter the same saloon, hotel, or barber shop as their traveling companions. Decades later, when Hollywood told the story of the Wild West, it chose to show only half of it and erased thousands of these men from the screen. Number 4. The revolver that went broke before it conquered the West. This is the story of a gun that almost never made it. Samuel Colt patented the revolver in 1836, and that same year opened his first factory in Paterson, New Jersey. The problem was that hardly anyone saw a use for it. The Army turned up its nose, and by 1842, the business had gone bankrupt. Colt spent years broke, doing whatever he could to pay the bills. The turning point came with the Mexican-American War. In 1847, Captain Samuel Walker, a Texas Ranger who had already used the gun in combat, approached Colt and ordered 1,000 revolvers for the Army. Since Colt no longer had a factory of his own, he teamed up with Eli Whitney, Jr. to fill the order. With the profits, he opened his armory in Hartford, Connecticut. Then came the gold rush. Thousands headed west, and demand for guns shot up. The man who had gone bankrupt and spent years down on his luck ended up owning one of the largest gun factories in the world. Number 5. The drought that drove half the settlers away. Few people know this, but the Great Plains hide a cruel secret. About every 20 years, the rain simply disappears. And that is exactly what happened between 1887 and 1896. The families who had crossed the country in search of the land promised by the Homestead Act watched the soil crack and their crops die. The result? About half the settlers gave up everything and left. Towns that had sprung up out of nowhere in Nebraska and Kansas shrank until they nearly vanished. In western Kansas, entire counties lost too many people to survive. But here comes the chilling part. Nature does not learn, and neither does man. 40 years later, in the 1930s, the same land went through the Dust Bowl. The same drought, the same mistakes, the same tragedy. For half of those families, the Wild West was not adventure or glory. It was a quiet failure that Hollywood never had the courage to show. Number 6. The Opera House in the Clouds. Imagine climbing more than 10,000 feet up a mountain, almost to where the air starts getting thin, and finding an opera house at the top. That was the town of Leadville, Colorado. In the late 1870s, silver poured out of the ground and turned that mining camp into the second largest city in the state, with nearly 35,000 residents. A merchant named Horace Tabor struck it rich with the matchless mine and, in 1879, spent about $40,000 to build the Tabor Opera House in just 100 days, the most expensive building in all of Colorado at the time. 3 years later, writer Oscar Wilde stepped onto that stage wearing a velvet suit to talk about art in front of an audience of armed miners. They listened in silence. At the end, they took the Irishman down to the bottom of the mine and served him his dinner. First glass, whiskey. Second glass, whiskey. Third glass, whiskey. And Wilde drank it all without blinking. Number 7. While Hollywood was showing stagecoaches, Denver was already answering the phone. Pay attention to this detail. In February 1879, just 3 years after Alexander Graham Bell patented the telephone, the city of Denver set up the first commercial telephone system in the entire West. It started small, with about 161 subscribers connected to a switchboard installed inside a shoe store. But here is what almost no one tells you. It was the 17th telephone exchange in the entire country and one of the largest in the world at the time. And who rushed to use the new technology first? The mining crowd. In gold and silver towns, knowing the price of ore right away was worth a fortune. Even Horace Tabor, one of the region's major mining magnates, set up his own exchange. So, forget the idea that the Wild West was backward. While much of the world did not even know what a telephone was, Denver was already making calls. Number 8. Snake oil was sometimes real medicine. Everyone knows the phrase snake oil as another word for a scam, but the story behind it is very different from what its reputation suggests. The original snake oil arrived in the United States in the late 19th century, brought by Chinese workers who built the railroads across the West. After spending days breaking rocks, they rubbed fat from the Chinese water snake onto their aching joints. And it really did help. Today, we understand why. That fat was packed with omega-3 fatty acids, which actually help reduce inflammation. The damage came later. A salesman named Clark Stanley took the name, filled bottles with mineral oil, beef fat, and pepper, and started selling it as a miracle cure. There was not a single drop of snake in it. When the government had it tested, the whole scam fell apart. That was when snake oil became a nickname for fraud. But the original remedy really did have science behind it. Number 9. The railroads sold land that did not exist. In the late 19th century, Congress gave railroad companies about 170 million acres of public land. The idea seemed simple. The companies would sell those lots to pay for the tracks. And they did. They sent agents to Germany, Sweden, and Norway with brochures promising fertile plains and rich soil. Entire families sold everything they owned and crossed the ocean in search of that land. What they found was something else. Much of it was dry, nearly desert, with no water for farming. The settlers arrived, looked around, and realized too late that they had bought dust. It was not a mistake or bad luck. It was advertising deliberately created by the biggest companies in the country, which made money twice, from the government and from the pockets of the people who believed them. Millions headed west, chasing a dream that, on paper, had never existed. Number 10. The frontier closed on paper in 1890. Here is something almost no one learns in school. In 1890, a census official wrote one short sentence that changed everything. There was no longer a frontier line in the United States. For the first time since the country was founded, the map no longer had that empty space out west, waiting to be conquered. 3 years later, historian Frederick Jackson Turner stepped onto a stage and said what many people felt deep down. The frontier had shaped the American character, and now it was over. Not in a great battle, not in a shootout at sunset. It ended inside a census report, in a draft written by a bureaucrat in a suit. Meanwhile, Buffalo Bill packed arenas by acting out the Wild West that was already dying right before his eyes. The myth was still going strong in the ring, but the real West had quietly closed its doors, with no audience, only on paper. Number 11. The city within the city. A lot of people think Chinatowns were created because Chinese people wanted to stay together. The truth is different. They had no choice. The law would not allow it. They could not buy land. They could not rent homes in respectable neighborhoods. They could not enroll their children in schools with white children. So they stayed wherever they were allowed to stay. In San Francisco, about 8,000 people were packed into 12 city blocks. Not because they liked living in cramped conditions, but because the city slammed every other door in their faces. What movies show as a neighborhood full of charm and mystery was, in the end, a pen created on paper. Every alley, every door, every wall in that place carried the same message: stay there and do not leave. A city within the city, built not by the will of the people who lived there, but by the laws of the people in charge. Number 12. The blizzard that caught the children on their way home. On the morning of January 12, 1888, the weather was so mild across the Midwestern plains that many children went to school without heavy coats. No one suspected what was coming. Around noon, a mass of polar air swept down from Canada, and the temperature dropped by dozens of degrees within a matter of hours. The sky turned into a white wall of snow and wind. In parts of North Dakota, temperatures fell to 40 degrees below zero. The problem was that the children were far from home. Many teachers kept their students inside the school. Wherever a different decision was made, the result was tragic. Children got lost in the snow just a few steps from their own doors, unable to see anything. When the storm passed, about 235 people were dead, many of them children. That is why the disaster became forever known as the Children's Blizzard. Number 13. Every trail's worst nightmare. Imagine waking up in the middle of the night with the ground shaking beneath you. It was the sound every cowboy learned to fear. When a herd of 1,000 to 3,000 cattle panicked, it took off running and did not stop until it had gone about 5 miles. The men mounted their horses in the dark and tried to reach the front of the herd to turn it into one big circle. They called this milling, and the idea was to keep the cattle circling until they got tired and calmed down. Anyone who fell off their horse in front of that moving mass did not stand a chance. They were trampled to death in the dust. And the worst part was that almost anything could set it off. Thunder, lightning, the flash of a match, the scent of a wild bull. That was all it took. The men's diaries describe entire nights without sleep, with the herd restless and ready to stampede at any second. From the first day of the trip to the last, that fear never went away. Number 14. 10-cent photos made it all the way to the cowboys. Imagine paying 10 cents and walking away with your portrait on a sheet of metal just a few minutes later. That was how the tintype worked, an inexpensive way to take pictures that appeared in the mid-19th century. No fancy studio. The photographer packed up a portable kit, loaded everything onto the back of a mule, and traveled across the West looking for customers. He charged 10 to 15 cents per picture. That sounds cheap, but someone who worked all day earned about $1. Even so, plenty of people paid. It was a luxury the average man could afford. And here is the interesting part. Almost every real photograph of a cowboy or gunslinger that has survived to this day came from those traveling photographers. Jesse James sat in front of the camera. Billy the Kid did too. The only confirmed image of Billy is actually a tintype. That was how the Wild West got a face and became a legend. Number 15. The river Mark Twain made famous also killed people every year. In Mark Twain's books, the Mississippi is all about adventure, rafts, and freedom. But the people who lived along its banks saw something else. Every spring, the Mississippi and Missouri rivers rose and swallowed everything in their path: crops, livestock, homes, and roads. The Great Flood of 1882 was one of the worst of the century. The water broke through the levees in dozens of places and left thousands of families homeless overnight. And here is what few people stop to think about. Back then, there were no dams to hold back the river, no weather forecasts to warn anyone, and no insurance to cover the loss. A farmer would wake up with water inside his house and no help was coming. Washington almost never paid a dime. The family had to start over from nothing if they made it out alive. The same beautiful river from the stories was, for the people who lived along its banks, the most dangerous thing in the entire West. Number 16. Prisoners played baseball at Yuma Prison. Think about this. Inside one of the toughest prisons in the Wild West, men convicted of murder and robbery picked up a bat and ball on the same field as the guards. The Yuma Territorial Prison in Arizona opened in 1876 and operated for 33 years, sitting in the desert along the Colorado River. And there, in the 1880s, prisoners and guards played baseball games as if the walls did not even exist. The sport had spread during the Civil War, when soldiers carried the game all across the country. By 1870, cities like Denver, Salt Lake City, and San Francisco already had their own teams. In the West, all it took was a bat, a ball, and a patch of open ground for a game to begin. What the movies never showed was this. America's national pastime had already reached the frontier among gunslingers and sheriffs long before the bleachers and the big stadiums. Number 17. The 10-cent books that invented the cowboy. Before movies, before TV, the hero of the Wild West was already being manufactured, and it cost only 10 cents. Starting in 1860, these cheap little adventure books began rolling off the presses on an industrial scale. One publisher alone released 7,500 titles by 1898. These were the pages that turned Wild Bill Hickok into the Prince of Pistoliers, made Buffalo Bill the greatest hero in the country, and portrayed Kit Carson as a conqueror who never lost. It was all based on real men, but their stories were exaggerated until almost nothing real was left. And here is the interesting part. These men read the lies being told about them. Hickok was furious and went after the author. Buffalo Bill did the opposite. He embraced the legend and made a fortune from it. The myth of the West was already complete, long before Hollywood even existed. Number 18. The Spanish missions were forced labor. When we hear about the California missions, we picture quiet priests teaching religion, but the real story is much harsher. Between 1769 and 1833, the Franciscans built 21 missions along the coast. and they operated through the forced labor of native people. Once baptized, these native people were no longer allowed to leave. They were confined to mission lands, farming, building, and tending livestock from sunrise to sunset. Anyone who tried to escape was hunted down by soldiers. Anyone who missed mass or work was beaten. In 1769, about 300,000 native people lived in California. By 1848, only 150,000 remained. Half of them were gone. Some died from diseases brought by Europeans, but many could not survive the hunger, punishment, and confinement inside the missions. Even today, some people call this system cultural preservation. But the mission's own death records tell a very different story. Number 19. The company money that trapped workers. Think about it. You work all month, and at the end, you do not receive a single real cent. That was how many people lived in the United States. Coal mines, logging companies, and railroads paid workers with scrip, a voucher that was only good at the company's own store. The worker could not spend it anywhere else, and the prices there were much higher than at regular stores. When the wages did not cover the purchases, the difference became debt, deducted from the next month's pay. And the next month brought even more debt. It was a bill that never balanced. Quitting the job did not help either. The house where the family lived belonged to the company. Leaving the job meant ending up on the street. The 1955 song 16 Tons summed it all up in one line that became famous. I owe my soul to the company store. It was not an exaggeration. That was exactly how it worked, and the law allowed it. Number 20. The last real shootout wasn't in Tombstone. Everyone knows about the gunfight at the OK Corral in 1881. It became a legend. But the Wild West did not die there. It lasted much longer than most people realize. In 1900, nearly 20 years after Tombstone, the Wild Bunch, Butch Cassidy's gang, was still robbing trains and banks across rural Wyoming. Those outlaws entered the 20th century with guns in their hands. In 1901, the Sundance Kid was recognized after yet another bank robbery. And here is the part almost no one knows. In 1903, gunslinger Tom Horn went to the gallows. That same year, the Great Train Robbery, the first Western in history, premiered in theaters. Think about that for a moment. While audiences were watching cowboys on the big screen for the first time, real cowboys were still trading gunfire outside. For a few years, the Hollywood West and the real West walked side by side. Number 21. The women who arrived already sold. In 1860, the San Francisco census recorded something most history books would rather not mention. About 96% of the Chinese women working in the city were listed under a single occupation: prostitute. But that number hides the harshest part. Almost none of these women chose that life. They were bought from poor families in China, many of them still girls, with promises of a job in a private home or marriage on the other side of the ocean. When the ship docked, the truth came out. They arrived in debt, trapped in contracts that took years to pay off. The Tongs, secret Chinese criminal societies, ran this trafficking operation. One of them alone brought nearly 6,000 women between 1852 and 1873. And American law? It looked the other way. In California at the time, anyone who was not white could not even testify against a white person in court. Without citizenship, these women had no voice and nowhere to run. Number 22. Kill the Indian to save the man. That was how Richard Henry Pratt summed up his mission when he opened the Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania in 1879. Think about the weight those words carry. Native children were taken away from their parents, sometimes with armed agents knocking on the door, and sent to boarding schools hundreds of miles from home. When they arrived, their hair was cut by force. They were forbidden from praying the way they had been taught, and anyone who spoke their mother's language was beaten. The United States government kept this going for decades, and even documented everything in official reports. From Rock Springs to the Oklahoma land rush, from the winter that wiped out the cattle to the Chinese immigrant woman sold to pay off a debt. These were 22 stories no Western ever had the courage to show. The real Wild West did not fit into the good guy versus bad guy formula. It was too complicated and too human. Hollywood chose to make things up, but the records are still there, telling the version that was left off the screen.